You listen to me, you piece of trash! I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull! If you don't block that highway right now, innocent people are gonna die!
12 massive cargo trucks slammed their air brakes in unison, their deafening horns echoing through the valley. The lead driver, a tattooed ex-welder named Hank, jumped out of his cab furious. Standing alone in the middle of the highway, arms wide open, was a 17-year-old black boy covered in engine grease. He refused to move. To understand how a homeless kid from the scrapyard brought $1 million convoy to a dead stop and ended up putting the town's mayor in handcuffs, we have to go back 24 hours. It was a bitter, unforgiving Saturday night in the small town of Millbrook. The kind of night where the rain didn't just fall, it slashed horizontally, freezing everything it touched and turning the streets into slick black mirrors. Underneath the town's massive main steel highway bridge, 17-year-old Eli was shivering violently. He didn't have much to his name, just a tattered sleeping bag, the damp clothes on his back, and the one thing he protected more than his own life, a thick, grease-stained engineering notebook. For the past year, after finishing his grueling 12-hour shifts, sweeping floors and hauling scrap metal at the local junkyard, Eli had spent every single night huddled in the glow of a stolen flashlight. He studied the intricate principles of structural mechanics from advanced library books he had borrowed using a fake address. His precious notebook was filled edge to edge with meticulous load calculations, shear force vectors, and hand-drawn architectural schematics. It wasn't just a hobby. It was his obsession and his only ticket out of the dirt. But that night, the rhythmic pounding of the rain was suddenly pierced by something else, a sharp mechanical hiss that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Eli peeked out from behind a massive concrete pillar. Through the suffocating darkness, he saw a man in a yellow raincoat wielding a heavy-duty oxyacetylene torch. The blinding blue flame gnawed fiercely at the bridge's main load-bearing I-beam. Cascades of bright orange sparks rained down into the darkness, hissing violently as they hit the muddy river water below. Eli held his breath, pressing his back against the freezing concrete. Up on the muddy bank, illuminated briefly by the lightning, another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mayor Vance, unmistakable in his perfectly tailored suit, holding a massive golf umbrella. Vance pulled a thick, heavy envelope from his coat and handed it to the welder. A payoff. Without exchanging a single word, Vance turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the man to finish the catastrophic job. Eli stayed perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the welder finally packed up his glowing gear and drove off. Trembling not just from the biting cold but from sheer adrenaline, the teenager scrambled up the slippery, mud-slicked embankment to inspect the damage. He reached out cautiously, his calloused, dirty fingers brushing against the hot, blackened steel. The soot instantly burned his fingertips, but it was the terrifying realization that sent a cold shockwave down his spine. "God," he whispered, staring wide-eyed at the deep, devastating gouge in the metal. The entire load-bearing I-beam was fatally compromised. Drawing on every late-night calculation he had ever done, Eli's mind raced through the physics. The intense, concentrated heat of the oxyacetylene torch hadn't just cut the metal. It had fundamentally altered the crystalline structure of the steel itself, creating a massive weak point. The bridge, which normally carried heavy, high-speed interstate traffic, could now handle less than 10 tons before experiencing a catastrophic structural failure. He knew he had to warn the police immediately, but he had no idea that the local precinct was a trap far more dangerous than the failing bridge itself. By 2 a.m., Eli burst through the heavy oak doors of the Millbrook Police Department, completely drenched and breathless. Mud and black engine grease dripped heavily from his worn sneakers, staining the pristine, polished tile floor of the lobby. Behind the high wooden front desk sat Chief Miller, a heavy-set man who looked up from his paperwork with undisguised contempt. Chief Eli gasped, his chest heaving as he leaned against the counter. "The highway bridge. Somebody cut the main I-beam with a torch. It's going to collapse." Miller sighed loudly, eyeing the dirty puddle forming rapidly around the boy's feet. "Go sleep it off in an alley, kid. We don't have time for homeless junkies making up stories." Desperate, Eli slammed his tattered notebook onto the front desk. "Look at the math. I drew the stress vectors. I live under that bridge. I track the traffic weights every single day. The heavy morning convoy rolls through at exactly 6:30, and the steel won't hold." Chief Miller didn't even look at the meticulously drawn pages. With a swift, brutal backhand, he knocked the notebook off the counter. It hit the wet floor with a slap, scattering Eli's precious hand-drawn schematics across the tiles. Miller stepped out from behind the desk, his heavy leather boots intentionally stepping on and crushing the fragile pages. "You listen to me, you piece of trash," Miller growled, grabbing Eli by the collar of his soaked jacket and lifting him onto his toes. "I don't know what kind of insurance scam you're trying to pull, but Mayor Vance personally assured me that bridge project is perfectly fine." Eli's hands shook with raw fury, but he refused to break eye contact. He kept his voice steady. "If you don't block that highway right now, innocent people are going to die." That was all Miller needed to hear. He slammed Eli hard against the cinderblock wall, pulling out his heavy metal handcuffs. Within seconds, the cold steel snapped tightly around the teenager's wrists. Disturbing the peace, Miller spat, dragging the boy roughly toward the holding cells in the back. "Keep your mouth shut, or I'll have you thrown in a state juvenile facility so fast your head will spin." Miller thought he had successfully silenced the kid. He thought the mayor's lucrative secret was safe. But what Miller didn't know was that this 17-year-old boy wasn't just going to sit quietly while people died. At 5 a.m., the heavy metal door of the precinct lobby squeaked open. A former structural engineer with hands as scarred and permanently greased as Eli's Joe had rushed over to post the boy's bail. As Eli walked out of the holding cell, rubbing his bruised wrists, the first thing he did was drop to his knees. He desperately gathered his scattered, muddy notebook pages. He carefully wiped a smudge of dirt from a page, depicting a complex shear force diagram. Tears of absolute, overwhelming powerlessness welled up in his eyes, cutting clean tracks through the thick grease on his cheeks. "They won't listen," Joe Eli choked out, his voice cracking. 12 heavy cargo trucks are crossing that bridge at 6:30. The whole system is rigged. Joe knelt beside him on the cold floor, his massive calloused hand resting gently but firmly on Eli's shaking shoulder. "I'm going out there," Eli said, his voice hardening as he stood up, clutching the ruined book tightly to his chest. "If the cops won't stop them, I'll stand in the middle of the highway myself." Joe looked at the boy's ratty, oversized clothes, his bruised face, and the immense, terrifying weight he was carrying on his young shoulders. "Eli, if you go out there, they'll either arrest you for good or a trucker doing 60 miles per hour in the fog will run you over before he even sees you." Eli didn't waver. He looked straight back at his mentor. Joe smiled softly, a sad but immensely proud smile. He squeezed the boy's shoulder, pulling him close. "Listen to me, son. A rusty tool in the right hands is worth more than a gold watch on a fool. Don't you ever look at their expensive suits and doubt what's in your head." By 5:30 a.m., the freezing, relentless rain had finally morphed into a thick, suffocating fog that swallowed the entire town of Millbrook. Eli sprinted out of the heavy oak doors of the police precinct and tore down the cracked, uneven sidewalk toward the junkyard. His chest burned like fire with every shallow breath, his wet sneakers slapping loudly against the pavement. But he didn't stop until he reached the rusted chain-link fence of his makeshift home. Sitting in the back corner of the sprawling yard, partially buried under a tarp, was his only mode of transportation, a beat-up, severely rusted mountain bike. He grabbed the cold metal handlebars to pull it out, but his heart immediately sank into his stomach. The front tire was completely flat, the rubber pinched uselessly against the rim. "Damn it, no," he hissed through chattering teeth. His frozen, bleeding fingers fumbled frantically through a nearby pile of oily scrap metal until he found an old, squeaky hand pump. He desperately attached the nozzle to the valve, the metal freezing against his bruised skin. Every single second counted, and he was wasting them. Old Joe stepped out of his small, dimly lit aluminum trailer, holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Eli furiously pumping the deflated tire in the freezing mist. "Eli, listen to me," Joe said, his usually gruff voice much softer, laced with genuine fear. He set the coffee down on a rusted oil drum and walked over. "If you go out on that interstate highway and cause a massive scene, Chief Miller isn't just going to lock you up in a holding cell. He's going to make sure you get a felony charge for domestic terrorism or reckless endangerment. You can kiss that trade school application goodbye forever. You have absolutely no hard proof that anyone will believe." Eli didn't look up. He just pumped the tire faster, the rusted spring of the hand pump groaning loudly and rhythmically in the quiet, foggy yard. He finally yanked the nozzle off the valve, stood up and patted his chest pocket, feeling the reassuring, solid bulk of his engineering notebook. "I have the proof right here. The physics don't lie, Joe." Joe sighed deeply, a heavy defeated sound, watching the young boy straddle the squeaking undersized bike. Eli was gambling his entire future, and quite possibly his own life, on a desperate blind run into the fog. "The main bridge is 3 miles away," Eli said, wiping a mixture of freezing rain and engine grease from his eyes. He checked his cheap digital watch. "I have exactly 45 minutes to beat a 50-ton disaster to the finish line." Before Joe could say another word or reach out to grab his handlebars, Eli stood up hard on the pedals and disappeared into the blinding gray mist, the rusted bike chain screaming in protest as he forced it into high gear. At 5:50 a.m., across town, in the dry, luxurious warmth of City Hall, Mayor Vance was in an entirely different world. He sat comfortably in his plush, oversized leather chair, swirling a glass of incredibly expensive aged scotch. On his pristine mahogany desk sat a freshly signed multi-million-dollar contract for the new Millbrook Bridge reconstruction project. The insidious plan was beautifully simple. The old steel bridge suffers a sudden, unforeseen, catastrophic failure. The state immediately declares a state of emergency, and Vance's secretly owned shell company gets the massive no-bid, federal bailout contract to rebuild it from the ground up. His private, unlisted cell phone buzzed violently against the mahogany wood. It was Chief Miller. "It's done," Miller's gruff voice crackled through the speaker. The welder finished the cuts on the primary load-bearing supports. Vance stopped swirling his glass, his eyes narrowing. "Define minor hiccup, Chief." Some homeless junkie kid from the scrapyard saw the torch work. He came in here absolutely raving about structural integrity, I-beams, and stress vectors. "I locked the little punk up to keep him quiet, but old man Joe bailed him out 10 minutes ago." Vance's knuckles turned white as his grip tightened around his crystal glass. "Did you confiscate the notebook he was carrying?" There was a heavy, terrified pause on the other end of the line. "No, sir. I threw it on the wet floor to teach him a lesson. He must have picked it up on his way out." "You absolute idiot!" Vance roared, slamming his glass down onto the desk so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim and stained the multi-million-dollar contract. The mayor's polished, calm, political veneer completely cracked, revealing the ruthless criminal underneath. If that incredibly smart kid somehow managed to get those hand-drawn engineering calculations to an honest state inspector, the entire federal contract and Vance's freedom would go up in smoke. "Find him right now, Vance," hissed his voice, trembling with sheer venom. "I don't care what you have to do, Miller. Stop that kid before the morning convoy reaches that bridge." Miller hung up without a word. Within seconds, the piercing, terrifying wail of a police siren echoed through the fog-choked streets of Millbrook. By 6:15 a.m., Eli finally reached the long, sharply curving on-ramp that led to the main highway bridge. His legs were screaming in pure agony, his lungs burning from inhaling the freezing damp air. Just as he dropped his rusted bike onto the grassy shoulder, a sudden blinding flash of red and blue lights cut through the thick fog directly behind him. A police cruiser was creeping slowly down the frontage road, its powerful motorized spotlight sweeping back and forth aggressively through the mist, searching for him. Eli threw himself off the elevated shoulder and tumbled down the steep embankment into a dense patch of wild blackberry bushes. Sharp, jagged thorns tore mercilessly through his thin, soaked jacket, slicing deep into his forearms and cheeks, but he didn't dare make a single sound. He pressed his face flat into the freezing mud, his arms wrapped protectively around his chest, guarding the notebook with his very life. The cruiser slowed to an agonizing crawl. The massive spotlight washed over the thorny bushes, illuminating the mist and stopping just inches from Eli's muddy, worn-out boots. He held his breath until his chest physically ached, closing his eyes tight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cruiser accelerated, continuing its blind search down the frontage road. Eli exhaled a massive, shaky breath and crawled out of the thorns, fresh blood mixing with the heavy grease on his face. He scrambled up the muddy embankment and finally stood on the cracked, painted asphalt of the interstate highway. It was eerily, unnervingly quiet. The morning fog was so incredibly thick that he couldn't even see the towering metal superstructure of the bridge just 100 yards away. Then he felt it. The wet asphalt beneath his thin sneakers began to vibrate. It started as a subtle, low-frequency hum, then rapidly grew into a deep, rhythmic tremor that physically shook the ground beneath him. Through the dense gray fog, The low, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines echoed ominously down the valley. The morning convoy was here. 12 massive, fully loaded cargo trucks were hurtling blindly down the interstate at 60 miles per hour, completely unaware in the fog, heading straight for a bridge that was fundamentally broken. Eli didn't hesitate for a single second. He pulled off his dark, soaked jacket, revealing a faded neon yellow reflective vest he wore for his dangerous junkyard shifts. He marched with absolute purpose to the dead center of the highway, planted his feet firmly on the double yellow line, and raised his arms high above his head. The blinding, piercing white headlights of the lead truck tore through the fog like twin suns, a massive, unstoppable wall of screaming metal bearing down directly on him. If the driver didn't hit the heavy air brakes in the next 2 seconds, the 17-year-old boy would be pulverized instantly. What happened next would change the town of Millbrook forever. The deafening, ear-splitting shriek of 50 tons of locking air brakes tore through the morning fog like an incoming artillery shell. The massive 18-wheeler skidded violently on the wet asphalt, its enormous cab jackknifing slightly as the heavy tires desperately scorched the highway. A thick, suffocating, and incredibly acrid cloud of burning rubber and white smoke erupted from the undercarriage, engulfing Eli completely in a noxious haze. He coughed violently, his eyes tearing up instantly from the overwhelming stench of friction, but his worn sneakers remained firmly and stubbornly planted on the double yellow line. When the white smoke briefly cleared in the freezing wind, the massive chrome grille of the lead truck was exactly 3 feet away from his chest. The immense heat of the idling diesel engine radiated against his freezing, soaked skin. The heavy driver's side door swung open with a loud metallic groan, and Hank, a towering, heavily tattooed ex-welder built like a professional linebacker, jumped heavily down to the pavement. His face was beet red with pure, unadulterated fury. He gripped a heavy 2-foot-long steel wrench in his right hand, his scarred knuckles turning entirely white from the pressure. "Are you out of your damn mind, Hank?" roared, his deep voice booming easily over the loud, rhythmic idle of the truck's engine. "You stupid punk. I almost turned you into a grease stain on the pavement. Get the hell out of the way, right now, before I break your legs myself." Behind Hank's lead truck, the massive air horns of 11 other heavy cargo rigs blared in a deafening, incredibly frustrated chorus that echoed down the valley. The entire million-dollar interstate logistics convoy was completely bottlenecked on the highway, entirely blind in the dangerous fog and losing money by the second. Through the swirling toxic smoke and the blinding glare of the halogen headlights, Eli stood perfectly still. He didn't flinch. He didn't cower. Instead, his trembling, grease-stained hands shot high up into the freezing air, presenting his tattered, muddy engineering notebook like a desperate shield against the angry giant. The towering trucker took 2 heavy steps forward and raised his steel wrench entirely, ready to physically drag the crazy kid off the road by force. But what stopped him dead in his tracks wasn't the boy's defiant posture, it was his eyes. They weren't the erratic, unfocused, desperate eyes of a drug addict looking for a payout, nor were they the chaotic eyes of a teenager pulling a stupid internet prank. They were the intense, utterly focused, and terrifyingly calm eyes of someone fully prepared to stand in front of a firing squad to save a complete stranger. "Move!" yelled a harsh voice from behind. 3 other burly drivers had jumped out of their respective rigs and were marching aggressively up the wet shoulder. "Throw that little rat in the ditch so we can roll." Suddenly, the screaming, high-pitched wail of a police siren cut through the damp air. The Millbrook police cruiser, which had been methodically searching the frontage road below, burst through the dense fog and skidded to a violent halt on the grassy shoulder, tearing up mud. The aggressively flashing red and blue lights painted Eli's terrified, bruised face in chaotic strobe-like colors. The angry truck drivers backed off slightly, crossing their arms. "Good, the local cops are here to clean up the trash," one of them spat onto the asphalt. A young, highly aggressive patrolman leapt out of the cruiser, his right hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. He didn't hesitate for a single second. Acting on the chief's strict orders, he pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs and marched straight toward Eli, roughly grabbing the collar of the boy's soaked, thin jacket. "Mayor Vance wants you locked up, kid. The game is over. You're done." Eli realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he had exactly 30 seconds before he was thrown into the back of that cruiser and silenced forever. He didn't beg the officer. He didn't scream for help or claim innocence. Instead, he looked directly past the aggressive cop and locked his desperate eyes squarely on Hank. drawing a massive, physically shuddering breath of freezing air. Eli used every single ounce of strength left in his burning lungs and screamed the one thing he knew would make a veteran blue-collar worker stop and listen. The main I-beam is cut 80% stress failure on the load-bearing supports. The highly technical, highly specific engineering terminology sliced cleanly through the chaotic, angry noise of the highway. The other drivers exchanged confused looks, but Hank completely froze in his tracks. The massive ex-welder's eyes darted rapidly from the boy's desperate, pleading face to the towering, shadowy steel structure of the bridge just 100 yards ahead in the thick fog. The patrolman sneered, completely oblivious to the weight of those words. "Shut up, you little freak." He violently yanked Eli's arm up and behind his back, bringing the cold metal cuff down hard and painfully against the boy's bruised wrist. But right as the metal teeth were about to click shut and lock, a massive, incredibly calloused hand clamped down on the police officer's wrist like a heavy-duty hydraulic vise. It was Hank. "Hold on a second, officer," Hank said, his voice low, incredibly gravelly and dangerously calm. It was the tone of a man who was fully prepared for violence but hoping to avoid it. The young patrolman's eyes widened in genuine shock as he struggled to free his hand. "Back off, driver. This vagrant is under arrest by direct explicit order of the mayor for domestic terrorism and obstructing an interstate." Hank ignored the cop's frantic threats completely. He casually tightened his massive grip just enough to make the officer wince in pain and drop the handcuffs to the wet asphalt, then gently but firmly pushed the man aside. The towering driver looked down at Eli carefully, noting the heavy black engine grease permanently ingrained in the boy's cuticles, the thick calluses on his palms, and the worn-out neon reflective vest. This wasn't a junkie. This was a fellow blue-collar worker. "What exactly did you just say to me?" Hank demanded, pointing a massive scarred finger directly at Eli's chest. "The main load-bearing I-beam on that bridge," Eli gasped, rubbing his deeply bruised wrist as he stepped toward the trucker. "Somebody hit it with an oxyacetylene torch late last night. The localized heat fundamentally altered the crystalline structure of the steel itself. I did the math. With a 600-ton combined convoy load moving at speed, you'll trigger a catastrophic shear failure before your fourth truck even crosses the halfway point." Hank stared down at the boy in absolute silent shock. He reached out slowly with his own grease-stained hands and gently took the muddy, ruined notebook from Eli's trembling grip. He flipped open the damp, crinkled pages. The trucker had spent 15 arduous years building high-rise steel superstructures before he ever sat behind the wheel of a rig. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The pages were completely filled with intricate, flawlessly drawn cross-sectional diagrams, complex wind resistance variables, and highly advanced stress load calculations. It was the undeniable work of an absolute structural genius hidden beneath dirt and rags. "Hey," the patrolman barked, taking a step back and pulling out his shoulder radio, his voice trembling with anger. "I am ordering you to move this convoy right now, or I will cite every single one of you for illegally obstructing a federal interstate." Hank slowly closed the tattered notebook. He looked at the angry, red-faced cop, then looked down at Eli, who was shivering violently in the freezing fog but staring right back with unwavering resolve. Hank turned around and casually tossed his heavy steel wrench onto the wet asphalt. The loud metallic clatter echoed sharply through the tense silence of the stopped convoy. "Write the damn tickets," Hank growled at the cop, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. He turned back to his fellow drivers, holding up a massive hand. "Nobody moves a damn inch. Shut your engines down. I'm going down under that bridge to look for myself." Hank was knowingly risking his commercial driver's license, thousands of dollars in personal federal fines, and a direct, incredibly dangerous confrontation with a corrupt local government. But he was betting absolutely everything he had on a 17-year-old homeless kid. Because what Hank was about to find under that steel bridge would send the mayor of Millbrook straight to a federal prison. By 6:45 a.m., the dense, suffocating fog was finally beginning to lift slightly, revealing the gray, churning, freezing waters of the Millbrook River 50 feet below. Hank grabbed a heavy-duty, ultra-bright LED tactical flashlight from his truck's cab and gestured firmly for Eli to follow him. Together, the massive, heavily tattooed trucker and the shivering, exhausted teenager scrambled carefully down the steep, muddy embankment toward the dark underside of the interstate bridge. Up on the highway, the young, aggressive patrolman stood nervously by his cruiser, his right hand resting tightly on his holster as he watched them disappear into the heavy gloom. Underneath the massive bridge, it was completely dark, eerily silent and treacherously slippery. The massive concrete pylons were covered in decades of slick green moss and foul-smelling river slime. Hank's heavy steel-toed boots suddenly slipped on a jagged, wet rock, sending his massive frame sliding dangerously toward the freezing, fast-flowing water. Without missing a single beat, Eli shot out a grease-stained hand, wedging his worn, muddy sneaker hard against a concrete pylon and offering his small but surprisingly sturdy shoulder. Hank grabbed it tightly, his heavy breathing echoing in the dark as he stabilized himself. The towering trucker looked down at the boy and nodded slowly, a silent, profound acknowledgement of respect between two working men. "Show me the damage, kid," Hank grunted, his voice echoing under the concrete archways. Eli led him deep into the shadows, pointing directly to the massive primary load-bearing I-beam that anchored the entire central span of the steel bridge. Hank clicked on the blinding white beam of his heavy flashlight, cutting sharply through the damp, misty darkness. At first glance, from a distance of 20 feet, the heavy steel looked perfectly fine. But as Hank stepped closer, narrowing his experienced eyes, the blood in his veins ran completely cold. The saboteur had been highly skilled, but incredibly rushed. The massive, deep, fatal cut across the heavy steel web had been meticulously packed with a cheap, fast-hardening mixture of industrial plaster and dark sawdust, then heavily spray-painted black to perfectly match the oxidized, rusted metal around it. To an untrained eye or a lazy municipal inspector driving by at 40 miles per hour, it would simply look like a dark shadow or a harmless old weld scar. But Hank was a master steel worker. He saw exactly what Eli had seen hours earlier. The cheap plaster was already beginning to crack and flake away at the jagged edges, revealing the undeniable localized heat discoloration of an industrial oxyacetylene torch. Furthermore, Eli reached up and wiped his bare fingers across the cold metal, showing Hank the fresh, powdery black soot that instantly stained his pale skin. Hank ran his thick, heavily calloused fingers over the hidden deadly scar. He felt the brittle texture. The crystalline structure of the steel had been fundamentally altered and fatally weakened by the intense, highly concentrated heat. If 12 massive cargo trucks weighing well over 600 tons combined had rolled across this severely compromised span at 60 miles per hour, the sudden extreme downward force would have sheared the steel completely in half. The entire multi-ton bridge would have collapsed instantly into the freezing, violent river below, taking dozens of innocent, hard-working lives with it. The homeless kid had been absolutely 100% right. Up on the highway, the patrolman's shoulder radio crackled loudly to life. Chief Miller's enraged voice echoed over the frequency, demanding an immediate update and screaming explicit orders to arrest the homeless vagrant for public endangerment and clear the convoy by any means necessary, including physical force. The towering trucker didn't say a single word. He didn't yell back up to the cop. He just reached down to his heavy leather belt, pulled out his commercial high-range CB radio, and switched it directly to the emergency federal channel. By 7 a.m., the local airwaves were completely and utterly alive. Hank keyed his heavy-duty radio, broadcasting at maximum wattage on Channel 9, the international emergency frequency, constantly monitored by the state police, federal authorities, and every trucker on the road. "Breaker, breaker, this is Convoy, lead Hank on Interstate 95 Millbrook span. I am declaring an absolute Level 1 structural emergency. We have a primary load-bearing I-beam that has been intentionally cut and camouflaged with a torch. I repeat, this is an act of intentional catastrophic sabotage. The local PD is completely compromised and is actively trying to force a 600-ton load over a dead bridge. Do not let anyone cross this span." While Hank continuously broadcasted the dire warning to every trucker, dispatcher, and state trooper within a 50-mile radius, the 11 other drivers in the halted convoy didn't just sit comfortably in their heated cabs. They climbed down the steep, muddy embankment themselves to see the damage firsthand. What they saw horrified and infuriated them. Within seconds, 11 smartphones were pulled out, their bright LED flashes violently illuminating the damp darkness under the bridge. The angry drivers immediately started live streaming the camouflaged cut directly to social media, taking high-resolution photos of the crumbling plaster, the undeniable scorch marks, and the massive, deadly structural crack. 10 minutes later, Chief Miller's heavy black SUV came roaring recklessly down the frontage road, its sirens blaring aggressively. The overweight, red-faced chief slammed his heavy door open and marched furiously toward the bridge, fully unholstering his service weapon to establish absolute dominance. "I ordered this federal highway cleared 10 minutes ago," Miller screamed, angry spittle flying from his lips. "I am arresting that vagrant kid right now, and I am personally revoking the commercial license of every single driver who doesn't get back in their cab and drive." Hank emerged slowly from the muddy embankment, followed closely by Eli and the 11 angry, burly, grease-stained truckers. Hank stared down the corrupt chief of police with eyes as cold as the steel bridge. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his fists to fight. Hank calmly reached deep into his heavy denim pocket, pulled out the heavy brass ignition keys to his massive 18-wheeler, and threw them far out into the churning, freezing waters of the Millbrook River. Without missing a single beat, the 11 other drivers reached into their own pockets and simultaneously hurled their truck keys high into the air, watching them splash into the freezing water below. They crossed their massive arms and formed an impenetrable, solid, fiercely loyal human wall around Eli, standing defiantly in front of their massive, locked and completely immovable trucks. The highway was permanently blockaded. Nobody was crossing that bridge, and nobody was laying a single finger on the kid. Chief Miller froze in his tracks, the aggressive arrogance instantly draining from his pale face. He thought he completely controlled this small town through fear and intimidation, but he couldn't control the sheer, unbreakable solidarity of the American trucker. And much more importantly, he couldn't control the internet. The videos were already going viral across the entire country. By 7:30 a.m., inside the luxurious mahogany-paneled office of City Hall, Mayor Vance's perfect morning was rapidly descending into an absolute, inescapable nightmare. The multiple private phone lines on his massive desk were ringing incessantly, creating a chaotic, deafening symphony of pure panic. His terrified, trembling secretary burst through the heavy oak doors, her face completely pale and devoid of color. "Sir, you need to turn on the news television right now. It's an emergency." Vance, nursing a sudden, violently burning pain in his stomach from the expensive scotch, angrily grabbed the remote and clicked on the large, flat-screen TV mounted on his office wall. It was the state news network broadcasting live from a news helicopter hovering directly over the Millbrook Bridge. The shocking aerial footage showed over 20 heavily armed state police cruisers completely surrounding the corrupt local police force. Chief Miller was currently being disarmed, handcuffed, and shoved forcefully into the back of a state cruiser. But far worse than that, the news anchor's grim voice was utterly damning. "The governor has just announced a massive, immediate federal investigation into what authorities are officially calling an egregious act of infrastructural terrorism. Independent structural engineers on the scene have confirmed that the bridge's main supports were intentionally severed and camouflaged in an apparent highly coordinated scheme to force a catastrophic collapse." Vance's heart stopped dead in his chest. His breathing devolved into shallow, rapid, terrified gasps. He frantically yanked open his bottom desk drawer, his violently shaking hands, pulling out the multi-million-dollar no-bid reconstruction contract he had happily signed just 2 hours earlier. He desperately, frantically jammed the thick stack of papers into the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting next to his desk. The machine hummed loudly as it eagerly began to eat the damning, irrefutable evidence of his corruption. But it was far too late. The shredder had only consumed half the document when the heavy oak doors of the mayor's office didn't just open, they were violently and forcefully kicked open. 4 grim-faced, heavily armed FBI agents in dark windbreakers stormed into the luxurious office, their gold badges gleaming brightly under the expensive crystal chandelier. His multi-million-dollar plan hadn't just failed, it had blown up completely in his face. By 9 a.m., the freezing, miserable morning air was completely shattered by the blinding, rapid-fire flashes of dozens of aggressive press cameras. A massive, chaotic crowd of profoundly shocked townsfolk and shouting local reporters had completely swarmed the pristine white marble front steps of City Hall. The heavy, polished oak double doors swung violently open, and Mayor Vance emerged into the freezing, unforgiving air. He wasn't wearing his expensive, perfectly tailored Italian suit jacket anymore. His wrists were pulled tight and securely locked behind his back in a pair of heavy, freezing, unforgiving steel handcuffs. He was flanked tightly on both sides by two unsmiling, heavily armed federal FBI agents in dark windbreakers. Following closely behind him, looking utterly pathetic, was Chief Miller, his corrupt uniform stripped of its shiny brass badge. His heavy head hung low in absolute crushing, inescapable defeat. As the profoundly disgraced mayor was forcefully escorted down the long marble steps toward a waiting, heavily armored federal transport vehicle, his panicked, furiously darting eyes scanned the massive shouting crowd. Standing quietly near a flashing state trooper cruiser wrapped tightly in a thick, highly visible orange thermal blanket provided by a sympathetic paramedic was Eli. Beside him stood Uncle Joe, the old, fiercely loyal scrapyard owner, his weathered, deeply grease-stained hand resting firmly and proudly on the teenager's small, trembling shoulder. Vance stopped abruptly in his tracks, glaring violently and venomously at the homeless kid who had completely destroyed his perfect multi-million-dollar master plan. For a fleeting, desperate second, the arrogant mayor expected the poor, filthy, uneducated vagrant to look away, to cower in pathetic fear, just like the rest of the small town had done for years under his iron-fisted, corrupt rule. But Eli didn't look down. He didn't flinch. The young boy stood up incredibly straight, wrapping the thick thermal blanket tighter around his freezing shoulders, and met the disgraced mayor's furious, hateful gaze with absolute, unbreakable cold steel in his dark eyes. In that profound, utterly silent moment stretching between them, Vance realized the horrifying, humiliating truth. He hadn't been brilliantly outsmarted by a rival political faction or a massive, highly funded federal intelligence agency. His sprawling, untouchable empire of local corruption had been brought completely to its knees by a 17-year-old. Marginalized, homeless kid who swept up rusted scrap metal and taught himself advanced mechanical engineering under a flickering, dying street lamp. The mayor was looking at a minimum of 20 years in a high-security federal penitentiary, but for Eli, the day was just getting started. 3 days later, the normally quiet, deeply rusted iron gates of Uncle Joe's sprawling, dusty salvage yard were suddenly buzzing with unprecedented, deafening, chaotic activity. A massive, deep, ground-shaking roar of heavy diesel engines violently shook the narrow dirt road leading into the property. It wasn't a local garbage truck coming to dump junk. It was a massive, highly coordinated convoy of heavy commercial vehicles. Hank pulled his massive, shining 18-wheeler directly into the center of the scrapyard, his air brakes hissing loudly. He was followed closely by the 11 other veteran truckers from the Millbrook Bridge. They didn't come to sell scrap metal. Hank jumped down heavily from his high cab, a massive, genuine, deeply joyful grin breaking through his thick, heavily tattooed, grease-stained beard. He walked straight up to Eli, who was standing completely frozen in absolute shock, holding a dirty crescent wrench in his grease-covered hands. "We got something for you, kid," Hank rumbled loudly, his deep, booming voice carrying warmly across the rusted yard. The massive trucker reached into his heavy denim jacket and handed Eli a thick, securely sealed white envelope. Inside was a certified, heavily stamped cashier's check for exactly $50,000, a massive, utterly life-changing financial reward, aggressively collected and fiercely donated by the State Trucking Association to the brave boy who had saved 12 of their brothers from a watery, highly violent grave. But incredibly, that wasn't the most important piece of mail Eli received that extraordinary, world-shifting morning. Uncle Joe stepped forward, his cloudy, aging eyes glistening brightly with unshed, incredibly proud tears. He was holding out a thick, premium-grade manila envelope. The official return address, printed elegantly in the top left corner, didn't belong to a local government agency or a trucking union. It bore the prestigious, heavily gold-embossed academic seal of the Georgia Institute of Technology. Eli's hands shook violently, almost dropping his heavy wrench, as he carefully tore open the heavy, expensive envelope. Inside was a highly personalized, beautifully typed official letter, signed directly by the dean of the mechanical engineering department. The dean had personally seen the viral high-resolution videos of Eli's meticulously hand-drawn stress vectors, complex shear failure calculations, and advanced load-bearing mathematics that the angry truckers had broadcasted online. Recognizing a raw, brilliant, once-in-a-generation engineering genius trapped in poverty, The prestigious university was officially offering Elijah Sanders a full, completely unconditional 4-year academic scholarship, including full room and board. Eli stared blankly at the embossed golden university seal, his breath catching painfully and sharply in his tight throat. Hot, silent, deeply overwhelming tears began to fall rapidly down his cheeks, cutting clean, wet streaks through the thick black engine grease on his face. For the first time in his entire brutal, unforgiving life, he wasn't just a discarded, invisible, worthless, homeless kid anymore. He had a real, tangible, incredibly bright future. Sometimes the broken things society throws away and ignores turn out to be the most incredibly valuable, brilliant things in the entire world. 1 week later, the crisp, bright, beautifully warm morning sun shone down on the pristine, sprawling, impeccably manicured campus of the university. Eli stood quietly in front of the massive, highly ornate, wrought iron main gates. He didn't look like a marginalized vagrant anymore. He was wearing clean, properly fitted clothes. His hair was neatly and professionally cut, and the heavy, suffocating layers of dirt, misery, and black engine grease were completely scrubbed from his dark skin. A massive, incredibly deafening blast of a heavy commercial air horn echoed sharply and proudly through the normally quiet academic college town. Hank was illegally idling his massive, roaring 18-wheeler right at the main curb, completely blocking the morning traffic, just to personally drop the kid off at his new freshman dormitory. The towering, fiercely loyal trucker leaned far out of the high driver's window, grinning wildly and waving his massive, calloused hand. "Make us proud, engineer," Hank roared happily and loudly over the thrumming diesel engine. Before Eli had stepped out of the heavy high cab, Hank had handed him a highly personal parting gift. It wasn't just money. It was a brand new premium leather-bound, highly expensive engineering notebook, completely blank and waiting to be filled with brilliant calculations, alongside a state-of-the-art, incredibly precise set of digital biforthanal calipers. Eli clutched the beautiful, expensive new notebook tightly and protectively against his chest. He reached deeply into his backpack and gently pulled out his old, battered, deeply grease-stained, duct-taped journal. The fragile pages were still heavily warped, smeared, and completely ruined from the freezing rain on the bridge. He looked at the two books side by side in his hands. The old, ruined notebook had miraculously saved 12 innocent, hard-working lives and completely brought down a highly corrupt, untouchable political empire. The pristine new notebook was going to passionately build his entire future. Several wealthy, highly privileged college students walking past stopped dead in their tracks, staring in utter, open-mouthed amazement at the massive, illegally parked roaring semi-truck and the young, highly confident, intensely focused freshman stepping down from it. They had all seen his face plastered across every major national news network for the past 7 continuous days. Eli took a deep, beautifully shaky breath of the clean, highly academic, incredibly hopeful air. He firmly pushed the heavy, historic iron gates open and walked confidently onto the beautiful campus. He walked through those prestigious gates, not as a discarded, invisible, marginalized, homeless kid, but as the smartest, most fiercely determined structural mechanic in the entire state. Miles away from the bright, manicured lawns of that prestigious university, the rusted salvage yard sat quietly in the freezing, pouring rain, looking exactly the same as the night this incredible story first began. The flickering, dying glow of the single street lamp still cast long, lonely shadows over the piles of twisted scrap metal. But something profound had changed forever. There are people exactly like Elijah Sanders living in almost every single small town across this country. They are the invisible ones, the forgotten ones. People with deep, dark engine grease permanently stained under their fingernails and absolute once-in-a-generation genius resting quietly in their hands. Most of the time, the world simply walks right past them without a second glance, seeing only the superficial dirt, the worn-out clothes, and the poverty. Society never stops long enough to see the brilliant, unbreakable diamond hidden underneath. But sometimes all it takes is one single moment of immense, terrifying bravery to change everything. And sometimes all it takes is one person, like a hardened veteran trucker named Hank, to actually stop to look past the mud and to simply listen. When the sun rises over the newly repaired Millbrook Bridge, it serves as a silent, powerful reminder. We all drive blindly across bridges every single day, completely trusting the complex steel structures hidden beneath our feet. But how often do we actually trust the marginalized people standing right in front of our eyes? What would you have done if a freezing homeless teenager suddenly stood in the middle of a dark highway, directly in front of your speeding 50-ton truck? Would you have hit the heavy air brakes and listened to his crazy warning? Or would you have simply honked your horn, cursed him out, and kept driving straight into the abyss? Tell us your honest answer in the comments below. We want to hear what you would have done. If this incredible true story of bravery, engineering, and the unbreakable solidarity of the American trucker moved you, please hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring tale about the quiet, unsung heroes who keep our world from falling apart. Until next time, keep your eyes open and never judge a diamond by the dirt on its surface.